I got home 3 hours early because my body had finally given out on me. 14 years at the same sheet metal fabrication plant, and I'd only called in sick twice before. But that Thursday in February, my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't grip the press controls. My supervisor told me to go home before I lost a finger. I didn't argue. The driveway was empty when I pulled in, which made sense. My son-in-law worked days at the county roads department. My daughter's car would be at the school where she taught 3rd grade until 4. My grandson was at school too, 2nd grade, 7 years old, gap-toothed and loud, and the best thing in my life since my wife passed 3 years ago. The house felt strange from the moment I stepped inside. I couldn't name it right away. It was a feeling more than anything, like walking into a room where 2 people had just stopped talking. The air had a quality to it, still, held. I told myself I was feverish. I was. I dropped my jacket on the couch and went to the kitchen for water. That's when I heard it. A sound from the utility room. Low, rhythmic. Something scraping against the drywall. Scratch, pause, like a fingernail being dragged slowly down a surface over and over again. I stood in the kitchen doorway and listened. My son-in-law had mentioned mice the week before, said he'd seen droppings near the water heater. I'd offered to call an exterminator. He'd said he'd handle it himself. The sound fit. Of course it fit. A mouse in the wall cavity, scratching for a way out. I filled my glass and went upstairs to lie down. But I didn't sleep. I lay there with my eyes on the ceiling and the scratch, pause, working its way through the wall from somewhere below, and something in my chest wouldn't settle. I know how that sounds. I know the mind can manufacture meaning out of random noise when you're sick and tired and alone in a quiet house. I've told myself that many times since. It doesn't help. After 20 minutes, I got up. The utility room was off the kitchen, a narrow space, maybe 8 feet by 6, with a water heater on one wall and built-in shelving along the other. Cleaning supplies, extra towels, a pegboard with garden tools. I'd helped build that shelving myself, a weekend project about 4 years back when my daughter and her husband first bought the place. The sound was coming from behind the shelving unit. I pressed my hand flat against the drywall next to it. The scraping was right there, close, closer than a mouse would be. The sound had dimension to it, a weight that felt larger than something small and furry. I pulled on the shelving unit. It moved. That was the first thing that stopped me cold. I'd built that unit myself. I'd lag-bolted it to the studs. It should not have moved, but it swung out from the wall on the left side like a door on a hinge, smooth and quiet, revealing a gap of about 4 inches between the back of the shelving and the drywall. Fresh drywall, unpainted on the edges. The seams were visible if you knew what to look for. I've worked with metal my whole career, but I grew up in a house where my father did everything himself. I know what new drywall looks like when it's been put in recently. The tape lines, the way the mud hasn't fully settled at the edges. This section had been replaced. Recently, within the last few weeks, I'd have guessed. I went to the garage and got a hammer. I'm not sure I was thinking clearly. I was running a fever. I was acting on something that wasn't thought so much as instinct, or maybe dread. Some part of me already knowing, the rest of me not ready to know it yet. The first swing punched there clean. I made the hole larger with 4 more swings, pulling pieces away, and the smell hit me before I could see anything. Not rot. Nothing as dramatic as that. Damp insulation and something else. Something close and human. Stale breath. Sweat. I shone my phone light through the hole. My grandson was inside the wall. He was in a space about 2 feet wide, the gap between the interior drywall and the exterior wall, lined with insulation bats that had been pulled back to make room. He was sitting with his knees drawn up, his wrists zip-tied to a horizontal piece of blocking, his mouth sealed with a strip of packing tape. His eyes found my light and went wide, and he made a sound against the tape. Not a word, just a sound, but I knew it. I've known that sound since he was born. I am not going to tell you I stayed calm. I didn't. I tore the rest of the drywall away with my hands. I didn't feel the cuts until later, 3 of them across my right palm from the broken edges. I got the tape off his mouth as carefully as I could, and he gasped and said my name and started crying, and I was already pulling at the zip ties. Couldn't get them, ran for the kitchen scissors. His wrists were raw underneath. He'd been pulling against them. I got him out and sat on the utility room floor with him in my lap. his face against my shoulder, and I just held him. I don't know how long. His whole body was shaking. I was shaking too. "Are you hurt?" I kept asking. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" He shook his head. "How long have you been in there?" He said he thought since after breakfast. His mom had made oatmeal, and then his dad said he wasn't feeling well, so he wasn't going to school. And then he stopped. His face changed. "Grandpa," he said, "there's something else." I looked at him. "There's a door in the floor. Down in the crawl space. I heard it. Before they put me in the wall." He was 7. He was telling me this like he was reporting something he needed me to understand. "I heard something from down there, like knocking." I called 911 before I went back in. I want to be clear about that. I called first. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and stay with my grandson. I did not do the second part. I wrapped him in a blanket from the linen closet and sat him in the kitchen with the phone and the dispatcher's voice, and I went back to the utility room. I don't know what I expected to find. I think I expected nothing, that my grandson had been confused, that the knocking was pipes or settling or whatever it is houses do when they're stressed. I think I expected to find nothing and feel foolish and go back to the kitchen and wait for the sirens. The crawlspace access was in the floor of the utility room. A 24 by 24 hatch I'd always assumed was just for plumbing access. It lifted up on a pull ring. I went down with my phone light. The crawlspace ran the length of the house. About 3 feet of clearance, concrete block foundation walls, a vapor barrier across the dirt floor. Standard construction. I've been in dozens of spaces like it over the years for one reason or another. At the far end, against the rear foundation wall, there was a section that wasn't standard. A wood-framed enclosure had been built into the corner, rough lumber, plywood facing, padlocked. It was about 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep, the ceiling of it the floor, joists above. Ventilation holes had been drilled through the plywood at intervals. There was a combination padlock on a hasp. I heard breathing through the ventilation holes. I stood there in that crawl space, and I heard someone breathing on the other side of that plywood wall, and I cannot tell you what that felt like. There are no words I know that fit. I had never in my life felt anything like the cold that went through me in that moment. I called out. I said I was there to help, that I'd called the police, that help was coming. A child's voice said something I couldn't make out. I said, "How many of you are in there?" A pause, then 2, me and my sister. I went back up. I couldn't break the padlock. I didn't have the tools. I went back up and I stood in the kitchen with my grandson, and I waited for the police, and I think I repeated to myself, over and over, that help was coming. I think I needed to hear it as much as he did. 3 deputies arrived inside 7 minutes. 2 more came shortly after, and after that it was fire and rescue, and then 2 unmarked vehicles from County CID. I watched from the driveway with my grandson while they went in and out of my daughter's house. My daughter's house. The house I'd helped pay the down payment on. The house where I'd built shelves on a Saturday and cooked Thanksgiving dinner 6 times, and pushed my grandson on a rope swing in the backyard. The 2 children from the enclosure were a boy, 9, and a girl, 6. They were siblings. They'd been reported missing from a town 40 minutes north 11 days earlier. Their names had been on the news. I'd seen the alerts. I think most people in the county had. I hadn't made any connection because I had no reason to. They were dehydrated and frightened, and the girl had a respiratory infection from the damp. They were alive. That matters. I have to keep coming back to that. The deputies found my son-in-law at a hardware store on Route 9, buying what turned out to be additional lumber. He didn't run. He sat down on the floor of the lumber aisle when they approached him and didn't say a word. My daughter was picked up at the school at dismissal time. I'm told she became hysterical. I don't know what that means in terms of what she knew. I've never been able to get a straight answer about that, and maybe I don't want one. What I do know came out over the following weeks through the investigation and eventually through the trial. My son-in-law had been doing this for years. Not in that house. He and my daughter had only been there 5 years. Before that, they'd rented. Before that, he'd lived alone for 6 years after a previous relationship ended. The investigators found records and evidence going back nearly a decade. Children who'd gone missing from different counties, different states. He moved. He covered tracks. He was methodical in a way that made me sick to learn about because it meant all of it. Every dinner, every holiday, every time I shook his hand and called him son, was happening alongside something I couldn't see and refused to imagine. The enclosure in the crawl space, the framing inside the utility room wall, the modified shelving unit. He'd done the modifications himself over a long weekend while my daughter was visiting her aunt in Pensacola. My grandson had stayed with me that weekend. I remember it. I remember thinking it was nice that he'd used the time to work on the house. At trial, the prosecution showed photographs of what they'd found. The enclosure fitted with sleeping pads and a water jug and a bucket. The zip ties. The packing tape. The padlock with a 4-digit combination only he knew. My daughter pled to a lesser charge after cooperating with investigators. The official finding was that she hadn't known about the children in the crawl space, that she'd been told the enclosure was additional storage he'd been setting up as a surprise, and that she'd been discouraged from going into the crawl space because of a mold concern he'd invented. Whether I believe that is something I've been working through in therapy for 2 years, and I don't have an answer yet. My son-in-law received 3 consecutive life sentences. He is in a maximum security facility in the northern part of the state. I will not say his name. After the trial, I moved into a smaller house, a rental, and my grandson came to live with me. That was my daughter's choice made before sentencing, and I will give her credit for that one thing. He was in therapy twice a week for the first year. He still goes once a week. His therapist is a woman who specializes in childhood trauma, and she has done things for him I couldn't have done, said things I wouldn't have known to say. He's doing better. He's 9 now, 2 years on from that February, and he's in a baseball league, and he has 2 close friends, and he sleeps through the night most nights. The nights he doesn't, he comes down to the living room, and I'm usually still up, and we sit together on the couch and watch whatever's on. We don't always talk. We don't need to. I went back to work about 6 months after. My hands don't shake anymore. I think about that sound a lot. The scratch, pause, scratch, pause. I've asked myself 100 times what would have happened if I hadn't come home early that day, if I hadn't stood in the kitchen and listened instead of going straight upstairs, if I'd told myself it was mice and taken a Tylenol and gone to sleep. I don't let myself finish that thought. What I come back to instead is this. My grandson was 7 years old, and he was alone in a wall in the dark, and he was still paying attention, still listening, still trying to help. He heard something below him, and he remembered it, and he told me. A 7-year-old, wrist zip-tied, tape over his mouth, and the first thing he said when I got him out, the first coherent thing, was that there was something I needed to know. I am 61 years old. I have been in rooms with men who've been doing this work for 40 years, and I have never been as brave as my grandson was in that utility room. Listen to the children. They see things, they hear things, they remember. And when the house feels wrong and everything in you says don't let it go, don't let it go. I've sat with this for 2 years now, and the thing I keep coming back to isn't the rage or the grief, though both of those have had their seasons. What I keep coming back to is a February morning when a 7-year-old boy, wrists bound and alone in the dark, chose to use the first breath of free air he'd had in hours to tell me something important, not to cry for himself, not to ask what took me so long, to make sure I knew there was someone else who needed help. That's the part that undoes me every time. I've spent a lot of my life believing that character is something that shows up in the big moments, the ones you can prepare for, the ones you see coming. I don't believe that anymore. Character is what you do when you've been stripped of every comfort and every advantage and every reason to think clearly, and you still find a way to do the right thing. My grandson did that at 7 years old, zip-tied in a wall cavity, and I don't think I've ever done anything half as honorable in 61 years of trying. There's a version of me that asks what I missed, what I should have noticed, and the honest answer is, a lot. The locked crawl space I assumed was a plumbing thing. The weekend he said he was fixing up the house while my daughter was out of town. The way he always had an explanation before I'd finished asking the question. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't careless. I was trusting in the way you trust family. The way all of us do. Because the alternative is to live in suspicion of everyone you love, and that's not a life either. But I've learned the difference between trust and inattention. I've learned that the small things that don't quite fit, the fresh drywall, the explanation that comes just a beat too fast, The feeling in your chest when a house that should be empty feels like it's holding its breath. Those things deserve your attention, not paranoia. Attention. There's a difference, and my grandson paid the cost of me not knowing it sooner. What he showed me, though, what he demonstrated in that utility room, is something I try to carry with me now. He stayed sharp when he had every right to fall apart. He listened when he had every reason to go numb. He thought about someone besides himself when he was the one who needed saving. That's not something a child learns in a classroom. That's something that lives inside a person, and either it's there or it isn't. And in him it was there, burning clean and steady, even in the dark. I'm not going to dress this up in the language of fate or providence, because I don't know what I believe about any of that. What I know is simpler. The people who do harm rely on the rest of us looking away. They rely on our comfort, our politeness, our reluctance to make a scene over something that might turn out to be nothing. And the people who stop them, more often than not, are not the ones who were looking for a fight. They're just the ones who kept paying attention. My grandson is 9 now. He's loud and gap-toothed, and he's learning to hit a curveball. Some nights he still comes downstairs and sits with me and we watch whatever's on. I don't always know what he's thinking in those moments. I don't ask. But I see him. I am paying attention. That's the least I owe him, and I intend to keep paying it for as long as I'm here.